This is the Amidon Planet Podcast, episode 72. I'm your host, Joel Amidon. Thank you for joining me on this never-ending quest to figure out how to teach better. Today on the podcast is Sarah-SoonLing Blackburn. Now, before I get into Sarah-SoonLing Blackburn and jump into the conversation, which is an awesome conversation, I'm so excited to share it with you. This is just another example of why about getting better at teaching is about doing things together, right? I remember sometimes that when just beginning as a teacher, one of the things I wanted to do was just close my door and just figure things out for myself. And the more I did that, the worse I was as a teacher. But it was when I opened my door, walked down the hallway and talked with other teachers or had the meetings and thought about problems together that we were able to figure things out. It's like solidarity, and solidarity is a theme we'll talk about within this episode. And so thinking about things together and growing together and learning together is what made me a better teacher back when I was teaching high school math and now when I'm teaching teachers at the University of Mississippi. But also, too, in thinking about this podcast, it started off being myself in a closet talking into a recorder about a book I read, which was great. And I got to share it with people that I hoped would eventually listen to it, but it wasn't a lot, but that's okay. And the podcast got better when it said, you know what, let's have conversations with other people about these books or these topics, and just started doing that. But then now it's kind of getting to the place where there's a community of people that are listening, and all of a sudden they know what the podcast is about learning how to teach better. And then there comes a recommendation. So today's guest is a recommendation of a listener, Dr. Christy Livingston. Not only a listener, she's a guest. She's also a guest. We'll put a link to her episode in the show notes. But Christy reached out and said, hey, you should have Dr. Sarah-SoonLing Blackburn on. I think she's got some things to share that would be a great thing for your listeners to hear about, for you to learn about. And guess what? She's right. This was an awesome conversation. And I'm excited to share her work and her expertise. Her work focuses on identity, diversity, and justice with an emphasis on race and ethnicity. And so we're going to use one of her articles about the model minority myth to kind of focus our conversation, but we're going to talk about a couple of other things, kind of a flowing conversation. Again, that's kind of what we do, right? We have a conversation that it's almost like you as a listener are kind of sitting at the table with us as we're talking about some things about teaching. We get to learn and get better, and that's all we're trying to do here. So I'm not going to delay anymore. There's going to be lots of links and things to share. I was going to actually delay sharing this episode for 2 weeks because I'm trying to have a summer, but you know what? There's some things that are timely in here that you can access in the month of May. So I want to put it out there, and we'll put links to everything that you can access in the show notes, which will be at amidonplanet.com/episode 72. So go there, look for all the things. There's some free stuff that's available just for the month of May as we celebrate Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We want to make sure that you can take advantage of those resources. So they'll be there. And yeah, just sit back and listen and learn with this conversation with Dr. Sarah-SoonLing Blackburn. Sarah-SoonLing Blackburn, thank you for joining me on the Amidon Planet podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and, like we were just saying right before the podcast, where we're at, the summer has just began. And so I guess it's like the temperature is flowing into the little recording closet where I'm at right now. But again, on a beautiful day, thank you for stepping inside in order to have this conversation.
It is my pleasure. My favorite things to talk about are teaching and learning. And so this is just great to be here.
Well, you're on the right podcast. So we love to learn how to teach better. Fantastic. And so could you give just a little self-introduction about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm Sarah-SoonLing Blackburn. Sarah is great for this conversation. I'm an educator. I'm a speaker. I write, do lots of different things, but my main focus is on inclusion and belonging. So just in general, right, we know that kids learn better, they do better when they feel like they're seen at school, when they feel like they can be themselves, when they feel safe, when they feel like what they're learning is actually relevant to their lives. And it's all of those parts. We talk about the art and science of teaching. It's the parts of that art and science that are related to classroom culture, learning environments, the conditions that allow for great outcomes to happen for kids. So I started as a classroom teacher and then worked for many, many years as a teacher coach, still do that quite a bit, and generally support educators and others in creating more inclusive learning environments.
Fantastic. I want to jump back to what you just said before about the idea of inclusion and belonging. And thinking about I'm going to remember the professor. I'm going to go back. It was someone that I knew from Alice Udvari-Solner, who was my big influence back up in Wisconsin. Norman Kook. There we go. Norman Kook. And he would talk about the inversion sometimes of the hierarchy of needs. There we go. This is going to be a full citation list when we get there, when I get done with this podcast. But thinking about the inversion of the hierarchy of needs, where sometimes in classrooms, in order to sometimes it's put out there that before inclusion and belonging happen, there needs to be performance, right? That like I need to show that I can do things, and then now you can belong in the class. Versus like what you just emphasized and what is true is like, no, you need to feel like you are part of the place. You need to feel included. You feel like you can access the space. And then there's the opportunity to, like you said, access better student outcomes and better things that happen in the classroom. I don't know. Made me prompt that up.
No, I think that that's brilliant. So I was a trained high school English teacher. That's what I did in undergrad. And I was teaching high school English in Philadelphia, PA. And then when I moved to the Deep South, the district I moved to in the Delta, they needed a fourth grade teacher. And I was like, oh, I don't know anything about teaching fourth grade. I don't know the content. I know how to teach like high school English. I don't know anything about fourth grade math, for example. So my theory was, okay, what I do know is classroom culture. And if I can do that really well, then maybe my kids can, fill in the gaps that I don't have with the content knowledge, right. And I'll start to fill those in for myself. And that worked. And it kind of was this like discovery of stumbling into that in my own classroom and then figuring out how to replicate that in general and realizing that, of course, what it means to be included or belong doesn't look the same for all kids. So it kind of made me go back into my own history, like as an Asian American person, when were the times that I felt included? When were the times I didn't? How much did that have to do with identity versus like personality? And kind of down this entire rabbit hole of curiosity about what does it actually mean to belong at school? Yeah. And how do we support educators in creating environments where all kids can feel like they can be themselves and that who they are is just a wonderful thing.
Right. And I love how your approach to getting thrown into the fourth grade pool was thinking about what assets not only that you have, but then also assuming competence for your students and leaning on the assets that they have as well. And like that asset-based perspective of who we are as teachers and what we can access within the classroom. I like, not just like it had to be all on you and all on you as a teacher-centric classroom. Obviously that didn't sound like that was the case.
That was the hope, at least, right? I'm sure. Yeah. There are always plenty of stumbles and mistakes, but
definitely.
When I agree, I think that often as educators, we're very hard on ourselves, and that's good, right? We do need to improve. We need to be aware of our areas of growth. And sometimes we over focus on those without recognizing that we have strengths that we bring to the table that we can lean on. It's like a building, when there's one wall that's a little bit weaker. We don't just like tear everything down to fix that wall. We rely on the walls that are strong as we're putting up scaffolding and supports, as we're like making that other piece of the foundation strong so that the roof can continue to stay up the whole time that we're going.
I like that metaphor. I like it a lot. And I'm going to encourage folks that we'll put a bunch, you have a ton of work out there, but we're going to definitely put a link to your website.
Thanks.
Because of all the different stuff that you were talking to. And so like trying to have this wanted to have a conversation with you and thinking like, well, what's something we can focus on? And I saw your article about the model minority myth and wanted to, just address that and think about like, well, what is that work and how do we go about it? How do we go about addressing it and being active on it within the classroom, right, as teachers? And so, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go ahead.
I was going to say, well, just let's go for it right here. Well, what is the model minority myth?
Yeah, so the model minority myth is a stereotype that mostly in today's context in the United States in particular, and most parts of the Western world, is focused on Asian American students, particularly East and South Asian groups. And it's this idea that these are people who are more of like quote unquote desirable marginalized or minoritized communities. The idea that like, all Asians are so good at math and science, or Asians are super well behaved and hardworking. It's often used to kind of as a benchmark against which other groups are gauged. So it's like, oh, the Asians are doing really well, so why can't these other groups do well? And it's really complicated. On the surface, these are good things, right? Like, who doesn't want to be told, like, oh, you're really good at school, or your parents care about education more than other parents? But when you start to peel back the layers, you recognize all the detriments of this so-called positive stereotype, both on individuals and other groups of young people and people as a whole as well.
And so when you're thinking about some of the ramifications, like the harms that can happen from the model minority myth, and like what things do you see that permeate within a school setting?
Yeah, so you are a math educator, so this is great. Yes. I can talk transparently about my own journey with high school math, which is that I didn't really like high school math. I was in English. I loved English. I loved history. I went to a math and science magnet school in Virginia. And so, on the surface, I should have been like excellent in, math and science subjects. Reality is I got into that school because I had an excellent score on the writing and reading portion of the entrance exam. Was maybe like 50th percentile on the math one. Right. In one of I think my junior year math classes, I had this teacher come up to me once, and I had like maybe a B minus in his class. And he's like, Sarah, I really would expect more from someone like you. And it just hit. Sometimes you just hear it in a way where I was like, someone like me, I have never done well in this person's class before. What is he talking about? And then kind of looking around at who else is in my classroom, who else is high achieving, and realizing that I look like the stereotype of the kids who are going to have, an A in that class. And because this was a magnet school, I was actually one of the only upperclassmen in this math class. They were mostly like, freshmen and sophomores in this class with me. And that was really frustrating, because what I came to learn later on was actually this teacher had like extra tutoring opportunities that he was hosting at lunch and after school that I didn't know about, that other kids knew about. And, I don't think this was coming from any place of malice or harmful intent, but I think there is an assumption sometimes that a kid who doesn't match this little perceived box of who they are or what they should be good at, if they're not doing well, then maybe there's something just lazy about them or like inherently deficient, versus maybe they just need help, which isn't to say that I'm a poor mathematics student. Right. Later in college, I was like, no, I'm going to prove it to myself. I'm going to take these classes and do as well as I can. But I realized that, sometimes if we're not really seeing who the kids are for themselves, they're not going to get to that place of trying to figure out how to make it work for themselves. They're just going to write it off. And that's what I did. I just started skipping his class all the time. I hope my mom doesn't listen to this. I just stopped going. And I would just like turn in my homework super late. I'd wait until my friends got their homework back graded and just copy it and then turn it in. And I would take the ding on points for having it late, but I'd get 100% because it would be, copied off of their correct homework. And that's terrible. And it's all because of that feeling of like, well, it doesn't really matter what I do because he doesn't like know anything about me or see anything about me. And that plays out in schools and classrooms all over the country, where kids who don't feel like they are being seen for who they are, they just throw their hands up and they're like, well, I might as well just, F off and do whatever I'd rather be doing anyway. Yeah.
And I guess having that experience, is it almost like someone sees they're not really seeing you. They're just seeing like, well, the cover of a book. They're just seeing the cover. Yeah. They're not actually, they're not seeing who you are. And then all of a sudden you're not getting access to resources and things that you could have used to enhance your relationship with mathematics.
Right, exactly. There's that famous Time magazine article from, I think, 1987, and it's like those Asian American whiz kids, and it's got these like smiling East Asian kids, and they've got textbooks and a computer, and that is the predominant stereotype. And it continues, one of my kids was watching Disney Channel recently, and I walked through, and there's like this nerdy Asian girl with her violin and a stack of books. And I'm like, really? We're still doing this? Because that has led to significant documented mental health issues for many Asian American students who don't feel like they fit that perceived little box. So that's one of the big ways that it shows up in school, but it's also difficult because it creates kind of differences and assumptions about then what these kids are capable of or what role they should play. So an example I give is around leadership. Mm-hmm. We often see that Asian students are sort of underrated in their leadership competency capabilities and overrated in like good at following rules or organized. And again, that links to some of these stereotypes. So we will rarely see Asian students who are being asked to lead a brand new initiative or run the club. But they're very often like the secretary in the club. And that leads not just from school, but all the way into the workplace. So Asian Americans are overrepresented in like individual contributor roles across industries. There are more Asian Americans in white collar jobs kind of at the entry level and slightly above that than their representation in the general population, but they're the least likely group to hold that senior leadership position.
Wow.
And we don't usually know that. Actually, a survey that came out last year asked Americans, their perceptions on this issue. And most Americans think that Asians are fairly or are overrepresented in senior leadership when it's the exact opposite. And that plays out in the classroom. So teachers are like, oh, these kids are fine. They're good at school. They're going to be successful. I don't need to make sure that I create, a leadership related role for them in my classroom, or I don't need to figure out if they can be charismatic and visionary and, run the class play because that it's just like doesn't cross our mind sometimes if we're trapped again in these like stereotypical ways of thinking.
Yeah. So the need to push against those things and be actively questioning them and are those in play. That's
right.
Wow. You can I love that you throw in some these stats out there. Like there's a study, a kind of a famous study that's done a lot in my world where it's draw a scientist, draw a mathematician, and then it kind of brings out like, who are you imagining are the mathematicians? So I'll do it a lot of times with my elementary math methods class. And so they're drawing mathematicians and sometimes they look like me I'm not wearing my glasses, but some with glasses and kind of hair stuck up or like Einstein and stuff like that. But then, it's like, those pictures aren't representative of who's actually in the class and thinking about, are we seeing ourselves as doers of mathematics? And because the people that I'm looking at are going to be the instructional leaders in classrooms. And are you seeing yourselves as a doer of mathematics? And I will say that I've done it for a while and that is getting better, but even thinking about it from the other side of what you're talking about, who's a leader, right? Who's like drawing who's a leader or drawing who, like, what are these things that we're imagining in our heads? And those become places to push on, like, oh, what are some assumptions that I'm making about who are in these roles, right?
Yeah, that's huge. A lot of it comes down to, invisibility and representation. I ask people a lot if I do workshops, especially about Asian inclusion or Asian issues. I ask people, what did you learn about Asian people when you were in school? And the answer is usually like not much. Maybe ancient China, maybe like, oh, in middle school we talked about Japanese internment for half a day. Sometimes people will be like, railroads, right? But that's like about the extent of it. And that's hugely problematic because, Asian people have been in this country for centuries. And lots of different types of Asian people have been in this country for a very long time and done lots of different types of work. But if we don't see that at all of those, like the prevailing ideas, like who would we draw as a leader or who would we draw as a mathematician, all of that just fills in the gaps instead. That same study that I referenced earlier about leadership, they asked Americans to name a famous Asian American, and the number one answer was, I don't know, which came in at 42%. And then the next highest was Jackie Chan, who, is not actually American. He's from Hong Kong. And then the next answer was Bruce Lee, who has not been alive for quite a number of years at this point. So just thinking about like, wow, if that's all we have in our like popular imagination for who Asian people are, who Asian kids are, it's either I don't know or two martial artists, then how are we going to accurately create space for them to be all of who they might be in our classrooms and in our schools?
Yeah. So that, I mean, well, I guess that this goes right into action. So part of this is about, if we just go with the flow of where we're at, like you just said, like that's not, we can't do that. We just can't do that because we've seen the results of that. Right. And so what are the actions to take? Because this is an active thing. Teaching is active. Yeah. We're making decisions. We're making moves and decisions every single day on what we do with our students. And so what are some things that we can do to incorporate into those actions to combat the model minority myth?
Yeah, I think first, it's the same advice that we give teachers about just teaching in general, which is get to know our kids. Right. We have to get to know who they actually are, what they care about, what they're interested in, and both provide a lot of support and a lot of push at the same time. That's when kids thrive. That goes right into, the foundations of restorative practices even, right? That high support, high accountability. But it is true. The people who had the most, if we reflect back as adults, who had the strongest influence on your young life, you're likely going to pick someone who both had your back and pushed you. Mm-hmm. And we can't do that if we don't know who our kids are. We don't know what it means for that person to feel support, and we don't know what it is that they want to be pushed towards, or what, back to that metaphor of the house, what are the walls that they can lean on to be strong while we're pushing them to grow in another area. One big piece for me that I've become increasingly aware of and focused on with the model minority myth is the way that it affects other kids too, though, the way it affects non-Asian students and particularly students of other minoritized racial backgrounds, because it is used as this like, oh, the Asian kids are going to be great. Why can't you do well as well? The stereotype, right? Like Asian parents care the most about education. Definitionally, in that sentence, that means somebody else does not care. If you're saying these parents care the most, that means that you're saying like all these other people don't care. And that's really harmful because we know that parents want the best for their kids. And yet we're like upholding a quote unquote positive stereotype that affirms negative stereotypes about other groups. So it's not just kind of ending the model minority myth for the sake of the Asian kids in our classes, also for the sake of everyone, and starting to be aware of how there really is no such thing as a good stereotype. So even when we have positive biases in our classrooms, we are still harming others. To take it out of race for a second, I think about gender. Oftentimes, if I'm doing classroom observations, who is the kid who's being asked to go to the office to run errands? It's usually a girl. And, because there's the sense like they're more responsible, they're not going to go play and get in trouble along the way. And I'll talk to teachers who get really frustrated. They're like, why are my boys so irresponsible? Why can't I trust them to do anything? And it's like, well, you've never asked them to. So, they don't have practice. They don't know how. So this positive, quote unquote, positive stereotype about your, female identifying students is causing you to put your male identifying students at a disadvantage. So there's always a flip side negative to any quote unquote positive stereotype. And I think as we bring awareness to that also helps us see more urgency in recognizing where we might be doing this in our practice and places to kind of take that apart.
Well, and it's almost like it's weaponizing it, almost like we're going to make it into a play. Again, someone's up, someone's going to be down, right? And also too, like, and I just had this called out in me at a conference recently where we were working in some groups and we're going to brainstorm on some topic on good old math teacher education stuff. Must have been exciting. And where like, we're going to start writing on some whiteboard and it was called out like, hey, guess what? Usually who is going to be writing on the board? It's usually not the men. not the men in those cases, and
Right.
especially in an education setting. And so like it's called out like, hey, who's picking up the pen? And, and I thought to myself, well, my handwriting is not that great on these things. Well, just like you're saying, like, how do you make your handwriting better? You got to practice a little bit, right? You got to try. And so having, and you think about those are just two instances, but how many other things exist in our space where if we flip our sensor on and start thinking like, well, how are stereotypes in action around here? Because if we're not active against them, they're filling it, like you said, filling in the gaps around us. And so
Yeah.
I like that. No good stereotypes. That's right.
Yeah. One thing that's happening right now, which is depressing and also real, is how this, because you use the word weaponized, how this model minority stereotype has also been weaponized against sort of the real, also negative stereotypes that exist about Asian people. So we are seeing upticks in, acts of hatred, bias, sometimes physical violence in many Asian communities, and particularly East Asian communities in the country. And that has correlated with the pandemic.
Right.
And actually last week, a new report came out saying that more Americans blame Asian people for COVID now than they did in 2020. So that trend is sort of continuing to move forward, and that's affecting kids at school. So I've talked to lots of parents who are sharing stories of like, the kids won't play with my child anymore. They say like, you're going to get us sick, or they won't, they make fun of their food more. It's like, oh, your food is what made everyone sick. And that is real and it's happening. And yet, because the predominant stereotype is still this like successful math nerds, whatever thing, it's been a lot harder for some of these families and children to advocate for themselves because it kind of gets brushed off. It's like, what are you complaining about? Like, you all are doing fine. You all are successful. You all know how to do with this. Like, it's almost hard for them to advocate because there's also part of that stereotype that they're like meek and know their place and don't want to make waves. And so if they do start to raise an issue, it's like, oh, they just must be troublemakers. So it's making it harder to advocate for the real harms that are also happening. And it's weird that these are like the two coexisting stereotypes that exist at the same time. I can't quite wrap my head around that yet, but it's definitely something that lots of us are seeing playing out in schools at the moment.
Wow. I mean, so it goes back to like the beginning, we talked about inclusion and belonging. And so, and even thinking about holistically as a child, like success, if someone's achieving success in the classroom, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not success in other areas where the social, emotional aspect of things, and which that's, so I wonder about that too. So like, there's even, backlash now against social emotional learning where, I mean, the kinds of concerns that you're bringing up here, like having that as part of our classrooms, which Mississippi, we have social emotional learning standards, which is great. But like in other spaces, like those are being attacked as well. And so even to think like some of the tools you have in your toolbox to combat some of these things are being taken away. I don't know. That just came out. What if you have anything to say about that?
That's something I'm still trying to wrap my head around because, at the end of the day, what we want is for school to be a place where all kids can be successful. And I don't see the threat in that. But I do think that the kind of coming for social emotional learning, I do think that that's happening in bad faith. That's at least from my personal point of view, because I really can't. I can't wrap my head around like, who doesn't want kids to be like socially and emotionally well? But, it's been wrapped up with the like, quote unquote, critical race theory stuff. And it's been wrapped up with like divisive concepts, when I think that underestimates the intelligence of the people who live in this country. Like we have to stop thinking that acknowledging difference is in and of itself divisive, right? Like that, to me, just like, I think that we are all capable of recognizing that we can be different and get along. And actually, by acknowledging and celebrating our differences, that's the only way we will actually see each other and be able to get along. And not that naming or acknowledging difference is like somehow inherently bad or harmful. It really isn't and shouldn't be.
Yeah. Let's put an exclamation point on that. I did want to, and again, I appreciate your time. So I did want to touch on one other thing that I saw on your website. And then also it was on, I believe, the Teaching Tolerance website. You published something in the fall about solidarity and like, and thinking about the power of solidarity. And I can't think of a better time than now. We need more solidarity than ever. But I don't know if maybe you're talking to me about the power and maybe even the complexity of solidarity and making a difference, making a change, taking steps forward in what we're trying to do as teachers.
Yeah, I think solidarity is a beautiful concept. It's something that, very few people disagree with. And it's also one of those things that is harder to practice than it is to say, I believe in, right? It's not just like a nice word. We don't just like show up with a, fancy poster at a rally and then we're like, okay, I did my solidarity. That does matter. Don't get me wrong. Like it actually does have a lot of power when we see, photos of social justice movements that look diverse. Like that does have more power to shift things. And if it just feels like whatever the aggrieved party is in that moment are the ones who are showing up. But solidarity is both like noticing and naming and recognizing that we all have a huge range of identities and backgrounds and experiences and histories and personalities and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that our freedom, our futures, all of these things are actively tied up with one another. It's that old quote, and Dr. King says this too, like no one is free until we are all free.
Right.
Which is it's so real. My struggle might be different from your struggle, but that doesn't mean that they are not linked to one another's. In the classroom, I think a lot about how if we have that mentality of like, well, let me just like send those 5 kids out in the hallway so I can teach everyone else. I get where that comes from. I have been that frustrated teacher who is like, oh my gosh, just get them out of my room. Like we need to move forward and go forward. And yet that permanently excludes a group of people. Right. And we see, similar trends in who that group is, who is usually sent out. It's related to social class, to gender, to race, to all of these other factors. And also sends a message to the kids who stay in the room that it's okay to do that it is okay to write off your peers. It's okay to exclude. And that is harmful for the kids who stay in the room too. It's not just harmful for the kids who are out, it's harmful for everyone. So you asked about solidarity. What does solidarity take? A lot of it is just listening and being okay with like, what, I might not understand or relate to whatever your experience is that you're telling me about, but I trust that you know about the experience that you're telling me about. Right. And let me know how I can be there for you. Last year was really tough in the Asian American community for many people, especially for Asian women like myself. The killings that happened in Atlanta last year were really, really hard to deal with. And I keep reflecting on what it felt like for people from lots of different backgrounds to reach out afterwards and just check in and be like, hey, this thing happened. You're probably hurting. I don't really know what it's like, but I want to hold that with you. I mean, that sentiment of like, I don't really know what it's like, but I want to learn more and I want to help hold that with you. That can go such a long way. We all want what's best for all of our students. I really do believe that as educators. We don't go into education to become millionaires, right? Yeah. So we go in for like good, reasons related to wanting the future to be better for young people. And we have to recognize that for some of those young people, their stories, their experiences will be different from our own. And we might not understand what they're looking for or asking for, but we can certainly try to understand better. And we can also help to hold that with them so that they can thrive in whatever way thriving looks like for them, for their families and communities, and so on.
I like that. It's almost, I want to say like actively passive, but I mean, it's getting in the space and saying like, I am here, but like, I'm not going to say like, well, I have all the solutions and here they are for you, but like being in that space and saying, we're here and I'm willing to learn and provide what is needed in this space. We recently, as the School of Ed, for the first time, we walked in the Pride Parade that was went around the square here in Oxford, Mississippi, and it was the first time a whole school was represented. And it wasn't like we were saying like, "Hey, we've got the audience," because we don't. We don't. But it was like saying we're here, and then getting a chance to learn and listen and be like, and as teachers and as teachers of teachers, like. We are in this space. We need to be in this space. So we need to learn and figure out how we can be better in this space and be present. And so like there's having that, just love that idea of like, we don't have to have all the answers. I think a lot of times teachers, we want to have the answers, but we don't have to all the answers in order to express that idea of solidarity.
Yeah. It's sort of bringing it back to the model minority myth, some of the good, like stereotypes that pop up about Asian kids in the classroom. Even let's say like kids who make comments. So it'll happen. They'll be like, "Oh my gosh, like of course they have an A in math, like they're Asian," or like, "I don't want to work with them on this because they're going to get me sick," or whatever it is that happens in the classroom. Oftentimes, and I'll speak for myself. Yeah. Also, as educators, we want to like come down hard on the kid who said the thing that was hurtful. And yes, we want to address it, but if we don't provide the rationale for why that was hurtful, then really all they've learned is like, "Oh, don't say this in front of Miss So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so." Right. What they've internalized is like,
but say it over there.
Yeah, say it over there is fine. Like, just don't say it in front of me. Yeah. And we then forget about the needs of the kid who like had the thing said about them and all the other kids who heard what happened as well. I think a lot about a metaphor of, let's say you witness an accident between a car and a bicycle. When that happens, you don't run to the person driving the car to start yelling at them. You go to the person on the bicycle to make sure they're okay. And as an educator, if we can start orienting more towards those, metaphorical bike riders, the kids who are often the least centered, who are often the most bullied or targeted, we will create a safer space for everybody. Some people will say like, "Oh, this inclusion work, it's just like political and it's indoctrinating." And I say, no. I'd say like, we are not trying to put anyone else down, but rather we want all kids to be proud of who they are, not at the expense of anybody else. Right. And if that can be true for everyone, then everyone does better. Rather than, saying, "Well, we're going to just center this one group and like everyone else should just come along and be fine." Because in that case, all we're doing is like letting the car drivers just go around hitting bicycles willy-nilly. Right. Yeah. And, that's going to hurt all of us in the end.
Right. And that's a great metaphor, the bicycle metaphor. I heard Danny Martin from the University of Illinois at Chicago would talk about violence in the classroom. And like that would be, but if you think of it as violent, like you think about, you need to take care. If someone is a victim of violence, which, that is who you need to take care of. And then, and yes, there's consequences, but run over the car. Do you know what you just did versus that person needs help. So that's good. You just, I don't know.
Did we go all over the place? Did I ramble too much?
No, this is great. I'm like, well, I'm just going to say again, like you've got lots of great things on your website. And again, just even the insights and just around the model minority myth and some of the things that I'm thinking about and processing and how do I respond to that in the classroom, know that you've got a lot of other folks that are doing that. Here's what I would suggest people do is go to your website, go to the different things that you've written there, and they can look at some of those things and have a good conversation around what they're reading and what they're listening and thinking about how they're incorporating that practice. But you also have some other opportunities too on there for learning. I think you're doing some things with LinkedIn and whatever. There's all sorts of cool things. I don't know if you want to take a little, I'll hand over the floor to you. And so you can
plug away.
Things. Yeah, plug away.
I have a couple of courses on LinkedIn Learning. And if you're not a LinkedIn Learning subscriber, if it is still May when this comes out, then you should be able to access one of the courses for free. LinkedIn has made understanding and supporting Asian employees open to the public for the month of May in honor of AAPI Heritage Month. Beautiful. And it focuses more on sort of the adult-facing version of these stereotypes and things in the workplace, but I think it completely relates to classroom as well, because basically the same things that make adults thrive in the workplace are the things that make children thrive in schools. And it's very fluid between the two. I have another one that's also develop your interpersonal skills for inclusive workplaces. So again, focusing on inclusion and kind of the little ways that we can all contribute to creating more inclusion in basically every interaction that we have. So things like moving from judgment to curiosity, dealing with disagreement, seeing that disagreement in and of itself doesn't have to be a bad thing, but there are ways to disagree in good faith that can help. And actually, a lot of that comes from what I learned as a classroom teacher, things like accountable talk.
That's right.
So I wish that all adults had just had a teacher who taught them how to say, I disagree with Joel because blah, blah, blah. It would really make a more productive world that we lived in today. Right. What else? I am working on a book that's slated to come out late next year, hopefully. It is for middle grades, and it is about Chinese American history, focused on concepts of both exclusion and belonging. So again, we're trying to fill in some of those erasures and invisibility that have historically happened around these communities, and trying to provide more windows and mirrors for kids to explore various stories and identities. So yeah, those are just some of the things that I have going on. I appreciate you taking the time to let me share those.
Nice. Well, that sounds like maybe when that book comes out, another invitation to come back on the
I would love
podcast.
It.
There we go. Fantastic. And again, thank you again for your taking the time to talk with me. I appreciate it. I know that others have appreciated your work too. And it was, so when I said I was going to be talking with you, they were like, oh my goodness, she's so awesome. That's great. And again, check out all the materials, check out everything. It's pretty easy to find your website. It's Sarah-SoonLing Blackburn, right?
It's just Sarah-SoonLing.com.
Sarah-SoonLing.com.
My first name is Sarah-SoonLing. As far as I know, I'm the only person in the world with that first name. So yeah, you'll find me on every platform at Sarah-SoonLing and also on the internet.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right, there it is. Man, I'm still pondering some of the things. I love having these conversations where I get, and I talked about it last week with a conversation with Rob Harvilla, this idea of this cognitive shove, this shove that where you have a way that you kind of understand and think about the world, and then you get these kind of shoves to your brain, and you kind of get off balance a little bit, and then you have to think, okay, how do I incorporate this new knowledge into what I do in the classroom, how I interact with students. So just even the little metaphor about a student says something in a classroom towards somebody and you're like, ooh, I got to correct that student. Hey, we shouldn't say those things. But then think about it as the bicycle and the car metaphor. Think about, hey, you got to take care of the person that the violence was toward, that the comment was the person who it was toward. But not only that, but also the people around, there's some trauma that could exist there. And so, yes, we need to correct the person, but in what they said and why they say it, and teach them, not just say, don't do that, but why, but then also to pay attention to the person it was said to and the people that were in observation of it. It's a holistic, just like how we want to think about the whole child, we need to think about the whole environment in which the teaching has happened. So thinking about it classroom perspective or a community perspective. So again, great stuff. So again, we're going to post all the links to what Sarah-SoonLing mentioned in the episode. So again, there's that LinkedIn Learning course that'll be available. So through the month of May. So you want to take advantage of that. Also a bunch of other resources there on her website. It's great. It's kind of amazing, all the things she's got going on, or the things that she's in work in progress as well. So again, we'll put all the links in there. So you go to AmadonPlanet.com/episode 72. Find it there. You can also go to her website, Sarah-SoonLing.com. That's SarahSoonLing.com. All right. Thank you for listening. If you want to support the podcast, you can subscribe, rate, and review. You can also share the podcast. So wherever you're listening to this, somewhere there's probably a little box with an arrow out there. If you think, hey, someone needs to hear some of this brilliance from Sarah-SoonLing, go ahead and share it. And hit that little square with the arrow button, and you can send this via text or email or whatever. And so someone can take a listen to the podcast. And that's what we want to do. We want to share. We want to help everyone get better in their teaching, again, and how we think of teaching, not necessarily professional educators, but anyone that's trying to influence someone's relationship with content. So that could be a parent, it could be a pastor, that could be a neighbor, whatever, a family member, whatever you're doing. So again, if you want to support the podcast, subscribe, rate, and review, share. You can also subscribe to the I'm on a Planet download. Again, we got a free professional development opportunity with Sarah-SoonLing shared in the episode. So we want to, we'll share some of those things in the email list. And there's some other free professional development that's going on. So maybe as people's years are ending, they're like, you know what? I want to think about learning on my own time sometime this summer. Great. So I'll share some opportunities that have popped up recently. So we're going to do that. So if you want to go subscribe to the email list for the I'm on a Planet download, you can go and check amononplanet.com. There's many spots where there's a button to subscribe to the email list. Go ahead and do that, and we're going to send one out. I've said it, so we're going to put it out there, so there will be one in the very near future, maybe Monday. Okay? You can also follow at I'm on a Planet on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or like the I'm on a Planet Facebook page if you want to support and hear about what's going on I'm on a Planet. You can also check out the I'm on a Planet store, I'm on a Planet bookshop. Links are in the footer at amononplanet.com, where your purchases support the production costs of the podcast. Finally, thank you for listening to this episode of the I'm on a Planet podcast. Thanks to Sarah-SoonLing Blackburn for sharing her time and expertise. Thanks to Matt Mifflin for the music in this episode. And finally, thank you to all of you out there who are seeking to teach better and be the good in the world by investing in the lives of others. This world is a better place because you have decided to use gifts you have been given to serve others. Thank you for all that you do. Peace.